Okay, the first, what we might call major world religion that we're going to discuss is known as Zoroastrianism. Now, you may be saying to yourself, I've never heard of Zoroastrianism. How can it be a major world religion? And, well, you're kind of right. Zoroastrianism is still around, but it doesn't have a large number of followers, a large number of adherents anymore. But it's a significant world religion for its influence on the three major Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. But let's start in on Zoroastrianism. The founder of Zoroastrianism, and let me remind you that as you're watching this video, I suggest that you follow along in the class notes that are on the website, class notes for Unit 1, because a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about is found in the class notes and you won't have to write it all down. Okay, you can just underline it. All right, so Zoroastrianism was founded by a person by the name of Zoroaster. That's what we call him nowadays. In other languages, German for example, he's sometimes referred to as Zarathustra. They're both approximations of his name in the language of Avestan. He was born sometime before 600 BCE. And by the way, BCE means before the Common Era. The dates are the same as BC, before Christ, but BC obviously is a specific Christian terminology. So in this class, we'll be using BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, which means the Common Era, to refer to dates that Christians refer to as AD. Okay, so Zoroaster was born sometime before 600 BCE, perhaps as early as 1000, maybe even earlier. He was born into a priestly family of Medes. This is a group of people who lived in what is now modern-day Iran. And there was an ancient Iranian religion that existed, ancient Persian religion. Iran and Persia are basically the same thing when we talk about territory. And he was a reformer. And like most reformers who want to reform the traditional religion, he faced a lot of opposition. Apparently, the religion that he was trying to reform was very similar to the Vedic religion that is the forerunner of Hinduism. And we'll talk more about Vedic traditions when we get to Hinduism in a few weeks. But it's interesting to note that Zoroastrianism and Hinduism have this common root. They came from the plateau of Persia, and they spoke a very similar language. The language that Zarathustra or Zoroaster spoke was called, we call it Avestan, and the language that the Vedics spoke was Sanskrit, and the two are very closely related to one another. Okay, so Zoroaster was a religious reformer, and because he was trying to reform the religion, he had to flee from his homeland because he was being persecuted. He finally found refuge in the territory of a guy by the name of Vishtaspa, who was ruler of a region of Persia, and he was protected by him for some time. The Zoroastrian and Vedic cultures split over time, etymologically related words came to have very different meanings in the two cultures. And we can see this when we look at Hinduism as compared to Zoroastrianism. In Zoroastrianism, the word devas, are evil or false gods, whereas in the Vedic religions, devas are gods in general. They're the true gods. And you can see the same etymology in Western languages. In Latin, Deus is related to Deva. It just means God. In Greek, Theos means God. Zeus also comes from the same root. So Devas were false gods in Zoroastrianism and just regular gods in Vedic religions. Okay, another pair of words that are related etymologically but mean opposites in the two religious traditions. Ahuras in Zoroastrianism, Ahuras are the most important gods, whereas in the Vedic religions, the Asuras, it's the same word basically in Sanskrit, the Asuras are demons, essentially. They are the older gods who are in conflict with the Devas. In fact, going back to Ahura in Zoroastrianism, the main god of Zoroastrianism is Ahura Mazda. In fact, as it developed, Ahura Mazda became considered to be the only god in Zoroastrianism. Maybe this was one of the innovations that Zoroaster introduced, the notion that there was only one God, and this was something that the older religious tradition, those who followed the older religious tradition, just couldn't deal with. So, in a way, Zoroastrianism is the first great monotheistic religion. There are certainly a large cast of semi-divine beings, or lesser divine beings, if you want to call it that, both good and evil, that correspond to angels and demons. But Ahura Mazda, according to Zoroaster and his followers, was the only true God, and it was the greatest and most powerful of the gods, and in fact the only one worthy to be called God. All right, we'll talk more about Ahura Mazda in a minute. Zoroastrianism, modern Zoroastrianism, has a creed. It is sometimes called the good religion. They call themselves the good religion. And the creed is very simple. Good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. These are what Zoroastrians are expected to practice in their daily life. Good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Okay, let's talk about some of the doctrines, some of the beliefs and practices of Zoroastrianism. Number one, as I mentioned, Ahura Mazda is the supreme deity. He's the creator of all things. Ahura is an Avestan word that means light, like the light outside from the sun, or Lord, all right? And Mazda means wisdom. So Ahura Mazda means wise Lord. This name, as it was pronounced over time and as it was passed down, eventually was transformed into Ormazd. And sometimes you'll see references to Ormazd, and it's the same god as Ahura Mazda, just a more developed translation of his name. Zoroaster, according to Zoroastrianism, Zoroaster is the true prophet of Ahura Mazda. So Zoroaster had the kind of official interpretation of this god. Another doctrine of Zoroastrianism is that Ahura Mazda was opposed by the evil spirit named Angra Mainyu. This evil spirit corresponds to an evil spirit in other religious traditions, like Satan in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. So if Angra Mainyu opposed Ahura Mazda, who did he have to support him? Well, he had several supporting gods, or lesser gods, beings, the most important of which was Spinta Mainyu, which might be thought of as the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, that's a way to translate Spinta Mainyu. Other supporting deities or semi-deities included the Amesha Spintas, who were on the side of Ahura Mazda, and various evil devas on the side of Angra Mainyu. So you have lots of lesser divine beings or semi-divine beings on both sides, both good and evil. And so, as you can imagine, there's this constant struggle between good and evil that is characteristic of Zoroastrianism. Individual humans have freedom of choice, according to Zoroastrianism. They have free will. They can choose between good and evil. And they will be judged at the end of time on the basis of whether they make more good or more evil choices. So there's no concept of predestination or fate in Zoroastrianism, at least in the main branch of Zoroastrianism. According to Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda will ultimately triumph over evil, and humans will be judged on the basis of their deeds. The religion of Zoroastrianism is characterized by an emphasis on monotheism, that is, only one God exists, as opposed to polytheism, where the idea that many gods exist, or pantheism, the idea that there are gods everywhere, the gods permeate the universe. So monotheism is characteristic of Zoroastrianism. It's also characteristic of the major Western religious traditions that we'll talk about next. Another thing we find in Zoroastrianism is dualism, this strong struggle between good and evil. So there's not only the struggle in the human heart between good and evil, but also between spirits, good and evil spirits. And dualism is present to some extent in many religious traditions, but it's stronger. It has a stronger emphasis in Zoroastrianism than it does in many other religious traditions. Not all, but many other religious traditions. Another religious tradition that puts a great emphasis on dualism is Manichaeism, which is, well, it's a religious tradition that no longer exists, but it existed, in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries of the Common Era. Okay, another characteristic of Zoroastrianism is that their worship centers around sacred fire. So fire is seen as a symbol of the divine. It's a symbol of Ahura Mazda. The fire is so holy that they don't want to burn anything in it, unlike many traditions where they would sacrifice animals or wheat or something like that. For Zoroastrians, you wouldn't want to pollute the fire by burning an animal's carcass in it. So fire is sacred. Another characteristic of Zoroastrianism is the idea of a Fravashi. A Fravashi is a guardian spirit who sends the Urvan, that is the soul, into the material world. So the Fravashi, think of it as a guardian angel, right? The Fravashi takes the Urvan, the soul, and sends it into the world, into a body, and while it's there, the soul, is born, grows up, fights the battle of good versus evil, and then after death, at the point of death, on the 4th day after death, the Urvan returns to the Fravashi. And so the guardian spirit is there to watch over this Urvan throughout its life and to help it along the way. Okay, so that's another characteristic of Zoroastrianism. Apparently the Fravashi originally were the souls of the departed, so this may be a remnant of ancestor worship from the earlier religion. But in Zoroastrianism, the Fravashi are individual, separate beings. They're not departed human spirits. Now, what happens to humans when they die in Zoroastrianism? At death, all souls must cross a bridge called the Chinvat Bridge, or Chinvat Bridge. It's the Bridge of Judgment. And this bridge is guarded by 2 four-eyed dogs. To a wicked person trying to cross the bridge appears very narrow. In fact, so narrow that as they the wicked person walks across the bridge, he falls off, and the demon called Vizaresh will drag his soul to the house of lies. So the wicked people will be dragged to the house of lies. Whereas to the good person, the bridge looks wide, and it's easy to cross, and the good spirit, Dana, will lead his soul to the house of song. So what sounds like a better destination, the house of lies or the house of song? Hint, it's the house of song. Now, and in the house of song, they will be reunited with Ahura Mazda. Or united, I guess, not reunited, with Ahura Mazda. This idea of separate destinies for the good and evil is called by religion scholars the differentiated afterlife. There's a differentiated afterlife, as opposed to the notion that when people die, everybody goes to the same place. You find this in some religious, in the Hebrew Bible, for example, we find the notion of Sheol, a place of the dead where everybody goes. In the patriarchal narratives about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it talks about them when they get old and they die, their souls go down to Sheol, and it's not a place of reward or punishment. It's just a place where people go. Or think of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks in the Homeric epics. They all go to Hades. Good, bad, doesn't matter. They all go to Hades, and it's a place where they continue to have some existence, but it's not either good or bad. It's just continued existence. Well, the Zoroastrians were one of the first major religious traditions, maybe the first major religious tradition, to have this notion of a differentiated afterlife. Okay. Um, According to later Zoroastrian doctrine, world history was divided into 4 periods of 3,000 years. So the entire history of the world will span 12,000 years from the time when the world was created, when Ahura Mazda created the world. Then Angra Mainyu arose and threatened war. This goes on for 3,000 years. Ahura Mazda says, okay, I'll give you 3,000 years, but then after this 3,000, the struggle between good and evil will only last for another 9,000, and then you'll be defeated, Angra Mainyu. Remember, Angra Mainyu is the evil spirit. And so Angra Mainyu is so terrified he falls back, and for the remainder of that 3,000 years, he does nothing. However, he arises at the end of 3,000 years, and so in the second 3,000 years, various things happen that I won't get into, but the creation of the first human beings, male and female, are accomplished in this second 3,000 years. In the third 3,000 years, there are wars between the good and the evil spirits. There's a 1,000-year reign of an evil king. There's 1,000 years of human wars. And at the end of this third period of 3,000 years, the prophet Zoroaster arises and his followers. All right. And then the following 3,000 years are what we might call modern history. It's after Zoroaster. From time to time, followers of Zoroaster, other prophets will arise to lead the faithful. In the end, there will be a final battle, and the forces of good will defeat the forces of evil or falsehood, and the dead will be resurrected by Ahura Mazda, and eventually all people, even the evil people, will get beyond suffering and will be restored to eternal perfection. So it's a kind of universalism that eventually will happen in Zoroastrianism. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and in my next video, we'll talk a little bit more about Zoroastrianism and the history of the various Persian empires where Zoroastrianism had its heyday.